The file sat in a buff folder marked Most Secret on a desk at the Admiralty building in Whitehall, dated the 24th of June, 1952. Naval Staff Requirement N, a 39, ran to 14 pages of tightly typed specification, and it asked for something that no aircraft in the Western world could yet do. The Royal Navy wanted a two-seat strike aircraft that could take off from the deck of a fleet carrier, fly 600 nautical miles at a height of no more than 200 feet above the sea, and deliver a tactical nuclear weapon onto a Soviet warship or port facility before the enemy's radar operators had finished their tea. The document was signed by Vice Admiral Sir Guy Grantham, then 5th Sea Lord, and it carried the quiet fury of a service that had watched its strategic relevance erode since the surrender aboard USS Missouri. The context mattered enormously. In the spring of 1952, the Royal Navy possessed 6 fleet carriers in commission or refit, including HMS Eagle and HMS Ark Royal, the latter still being completed at Camel Laird on the Mersey. The Americans had already demonstrated at Eniwetok on the 1st of November 1952 that thermonuclear weapons were feasible, and the Soviets would follow with their Joe 4 device in August of the following year. Britain's own atomic test, Operation Hurricane, had detonated off the Montebello Islands on the 3rd of October 1952, producing a yield of roughly 25 kilotons. The question in the corridors of the Admiralty was simple and brutal. What use was a carrier fleet if it could not deliver a nuclear blow? The air staff at the Ministry of Defence had their own answer, and it did not include the Navy. Their programme, designated Operating Requirement 330, would become the Avro Vulcan, Handley Page Victor, and Vickers Valiant, the so-called V-Force. These aircraft would fly at 50,000 feet and drop Blue Danube freefall bombs from altitude. The Admiralty considered this approach, put plainly in a memorandum from Director of Naval Air Warfare on the 18th of May 1952, to be strategically obsolete within 5 years. Soviet surface-to-air missile development, particularly the S-75 system, later known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline, would render high-altitude penetration suicidal. The Admiralty's planners had read the intelligence summaries from the Joint Intelligence Committee, and they had drawn the obvious conclusion. The future belonged to the aircraft that flew low enough to hide inside the curvature of the Earth. NA-39 was therefore not merely a specification for an aeroplane. It was an argument about the shape of British deterrence, delivered in the technical language of airframe tolerances and weapons bay dimensions. The document stipulated a minimum combat radius of 400 nautical miles carrying a 2,000-pound weapon, a dash speed of Mach 0.85 at sea level, and the ability to operate from the existing Centaur and Audacious class carriers without requiring the installation of steam catapults beyond those already planned. It demanded a terrain-following capability at a time when such technology existed only in classified American laboratories. Tenders were circulated in the summer of 1953 to 8 British manufacturers. The submissions were due by the 31st of January 1954. Among them would come a design from a relatively small firm based on the Humber estuary, a company that had not built a frontline aircraft since the Skua dive bomber of 1938. Blackburn Aircraft Limited of Brough intended to win. The Joint Intelligence Committee paper, JIC 54/15, circulated on the 19th of March 1954, contained photographs that changed British naval thinking overnight. The images, taken by a Royal Air Force Canberra PR, Mark III, flying at 48,000 feet over the Baltic approaches, showed 3 long-hulled cruisers moored at the Baltaysky shipyard in Leningrad. These were Project 68 BI's vessels, designated by NATO as the Sverdlov-class. 16,600 tons standard displacement, 210 meters in length, armed with 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets and capable of 32.5 knots. The Soviets had already commissioned 7 of them and planned 24 in total. The strategic problem they posed was specific and urgent. The Sverdlovs were fast enough to break out into the North Atlantic and slip past the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap before the Royal Navy could intercept them. Once loose on the convoy routes, each cruiser could sink perhaps 2 million tons of merchant shipping before being run to ground. The memory of the Graf Spee, the Bismarck, and the Scharnhorst was barely a decade old, and every flag officer from Scapa Flow to Gibraltar understood what a single raider could do. First, Sea Lord Admiral Sir Roderick McGreiger told the Board of Admiralty on the 4th of May 1954 that we must assume the Russians will employ these ships precisely as the Germans employed theirs. The conventional answer would have been a fleet action, cruiser against cruiser, with air cover from Seahawks and Sea Venoms flying off the carriers. This answer was no longer adequate. The Sverdlovs carried the Kniga 68 fire control radar and, more importantly, were expected to receive surface-to-air missile upgrades within the decade. A Fairy Gannet or a Westland Wyvern attempting a conventional torpedo run would be annihilated before it closed to weapons release. The arithmetic was grim. Naval planners at the Directorate of Operational Requirements calculated that stopping a single Sverdlov with air-dropped conventional munitions would require a strike package of at least 40 aircraft, with expected losses of 60%. The nuclear solution was mathematically elegant. 1 aircraft, 1 bomb, 1 cruiser. The problem was delivery. A high-altitude approach, as favored by the V-force doctrine, was out of the question because Soviet task groups would be protected by their own air defense screens and would operate beyond the range of British land-based nuclear assets. The Americans had reached similar conclusions with their North American A.J. Savage and later the Douglas A-3 Sky Warrior, but both were designed around the assumption of relatively permissive airspace. The British, having fewer carriers and smaller air wings, could not afford such assumptions. Low-level penetration was the answer. Radar horizon calculations produced by the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, reference RAE, technical note Aero 2311, demonstrated that an aircraft flying at 100 feet above the sea would remain below the detection threshold of shipborne air search radars until approximately 12 miles from the target. At Mach 0.85, this gave the defender less than 90 seconds of warning. The attacker would release the weapon in a loft maneuver, pitching up sharply to throw the bomb forward on a ballistic arc, then reversing course in what was known as the low-altitude bombing system, or LABS maneuver. By the time the weapon detonated, the aircraft would be 30 miles away and still descending. This doctrine of sea-skimming nuclear strike was, by 1955, unique to the Royal Navy. The Americans flirted with it. The French had not yet considered it. The Admiralty staked its post-war relevance upon it. Brough Aerodrome sits on the north bank of the Humber, 10 miles west of Hull, on land that Blackburn Aircraft Limited had occupied since 1916. The Design Office, a long 2-story building overlooking the grass airfield, became in the spring of 1954 the workplace of perhaps the most talented team of aerodynamicists Britain had assembled outside the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Barry Laight, the chief designer, was 34 years old and had joined Blackburn from Bolton Paul. Under him worked Roy Boot, responsible for the airframe, and Bob Hardy, who led the aerodynamics section. The team numbered fewer than 60 men and women when work began on Blackburn's submission to NA 39, known internally as the B-103. The aerodynamic problem they faced was genuinely novel. An aircraft flying at Mach 0.85 at sea level encounters air that is roughly 4 times denser than at 30,000 feet. The dynamic pressure on the airframe at that speed and altitude exceeds 1,400 pounds per square foot, which is more than 3 times what the contemporary Hawker Hunter was stressed to tolerate. Turbulence, bird strikes, and wave-induced vertical gusts all become structural threats. The B-103 would need a wing strong enough to survive repeated low-level flight without fatigue cracking, yet efficient enough to cruise to the target and return with reserves. These two requirements, strength and efficiency, normally demand opposite solutions. Laight's team reached for 2 emerging technologies. The first was area rule, the principle articulated by Richard Whitcomb of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in 1952, which stated that transonic drag is minimized when the cross-sectional area of an aircraft taken at right angles to the flight path varies smoothly from nose to tail. The B-103 was given a distinctive pinched Coke bottle fuselage waist between the wing roots, with bulged rear fairings either side of the jet pipes. These fairings, which pilots would later call the bum, provided the smooth area distribution that kept compressibility drag manageable at high subsonic speeds. The second technology was boundary layer control. Compressed air was bled from the engines and ducted through narrow slits along the wing leading edges, the flap hinge lines, and across the tailplane. This high-pressure air energized the airflow over the control surfaces, allowing the aircraft to fly at low speeds with small wings. Small wings meant low gust response at sea level. Large wings, by contrast, would have buffeted the crew to unconsciousness. The wing itself was a remarkable piece of engineering. It spanned only 44 feet, was swept at 40 degrees at the quarter chord, and was machined from single slabs of aluminium copper alloy using techniques developed for the Bristol Britannia. The main spar was a single forged component, heat treated to withstand 250 million cycles of flexural loading. The fuselage was built around a single bomb bay of particular ingenuity. A rotating door carrying the weapon internally, which eliminated the drag and radar signature of external stores. When the attack run began, the door rotated through 180 degrees in 2 seconds, exposing the weapon to the slipstream at the moment of release. The cockpit sat the pilot and observer in tandem under a long perspex canopy, with the navigator observer operating the Blue Parrot attack radar developed by Ferranti at Edinburgh. By the time the mock-up was inspected at Brough in January 1955, the design team knew they had produced something unprecedented. Whether the Gyron Junior engines could deliver on their promise was another matter entirely. The weapon sat at the heart of everything. Redbeard, known formally as Target Marker, Bomb, Mark I, and covered by Operational Requirement 1127, was Britain's first tactical nuclear bomb. Development had begun at the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston in 1954 under William Penny, the physicist who had witnessed Nagasaki from an observation aircraft 9 years earlier. The weapon was physically smaller than its strategic cousin Blue Danube, measuring 12 feet in length, 28 inches in diameter, and weighing 1,750 pounds. 2 variants were eventually produced, a 15 kiloton version for tactical use and a 25 kiloton version for harder targets. Both used a plutonium implosion design derived from the Hurricane test device, though with significant refinements in the explosive lens arrangement and the neutron initiator. The dimensional constraint drove the entire B-103 airframe. The bomb bay had to accommodate Redbeard with clearance for the weapon's fins and the release mechanism, and the rotating bomb door had to close flush against the fuselage skin to preserve aerodynamic cleanliness. At Brough, the design team worked from full-size wooden mock-ups of Redbeard supplied by Aldermaston under the strictest security provisions of the Atomic Energy Act, 1946. The weapon was so sensitive that even senior Blackburn engineers were not permitted to know its yield, only its mass, center of gravity, and ballistic coefficient. Drawings were held in a vault in the design office and signed out against named authorization. The delivery profile imposed its own cruel demands. Redbeard was a free-fall weapon without guidance of any kind. Accuracy depended entirely on the aircraft's position, heading, and speed at the moment of release, combined with the ballistic behavior of the bomb through its trajectory. For a toss delivery from 200 feet, the weapon would climb to approximately 6,000 feet before falling onto the target some 3 miles ahead of the release point. Circular error probable was estimated at 400 yards for a trained crew. Against a Sverdlov cruiser 210 meters long, a 15 kiloton detonation at that distance would generate an overpressure of roughly 18 pounds per square inch at the target, which was more than sufficient to break the ship's back. The Royal Aircraft Establishment calculated that even a near miss of half a mile would render the vessel combat ineffective through blast damage, radiation contamination, and the wave effects on the surrounding sea. Weapon handling aboard the carriers presented its own intricate problems. Redbeard required a temperature-controlled environment, held between 15 and 25 degrees Celsius, and could not tolerate the humidity of a tropical hangar deck. Special air-conditioned magazines were fitted to HMS Victorious during her reconstruction at Portsmouth between 1950 and 1958, and to HMS Hermes during her completion at Vickers Armstrong's Barrow in 1959. The weapon was transported through the ship on dedicated trolleys by a small team of Royal Naval Armament Service technicians, and its final assembly involving the insertion of the plutonium pit into the high explosive lens assembly was performed only immediately before loading into the aircraft. This procedure, known as inserting the physics package, required approximately 40 minutes under ideal conditions. The Cabinet's Defence Committee, meeting at No. 10 Downing Street on the 12th of February 1957 under the chairmanship of Harold Macmillan, formally approved the deployment of Redbeard aboard Royal Navy carriers. The minute, held at the National Archives under CAB 131/18, authorised an initial production run of 40 weapons. Britain's maritime nuclear deterrent was now a matter of programme management. The de Havilland Gyron Junior was meant to be the engine that made everything work. A scaled-down derivative of the enormous Gyron used in the experimental Saunders Roe SR-53 mixed-power interceptor, the Junior was a single-shaft axial flow turbojet rated at 7,100 pounds of thrust at sea level. On paper, it suited the B-103 admirably, compact enough to fit within the narrow engine nacelles either side of the bomb bay, reasonably economical at cruise power, and already under development at de Havilland's Stag Lane Works. The specification had been fixed in 1955, and the first prototype, XK 486, flew from Bedford's Royal Aircraft Establishment runway on the 30th of April 1958, with Blackburn's chief test pilot Derek Whitehead at the controls. the problems began almost at once. The Gyron Junior was an engine designed for high-altitude operation, and it performed poorly in the hot, dense, salt-laden air at sea level. Thrust fell off rapidly with forward speed, compressor surge became a persistent hazard during catapult launches, and the engine's response to throttle inputs was sluggish in a way that made carrier operations genuinely dangerous. During a wave-off from HMS Victorious in the Mediterranean in February 1960, a Mark I Buccaneer nearly struck the ship's stern when the pilot demanded full thrust and received only a gradual spooling up over 4 seconds. The accident report, filed by the Naval Air Warfare Division, noted that the margin between survival and catastrophe had been under 15 feet. The Mark I entered fleet service with number 800 Naval Air Squadron at RNAS Lossiemouth on the 17th of July 1962, but its operational limitations were obvious within weeks. Fully loaded with Redbeard, external drop tanks, and a full fuel load, the aircraft could barely get off the deck. The standard launch technique involved flying off with reduced fuel and rendezvousing with a tanker, usually a supermarine scimitar, converted to the buddy refueling role immediately after takeoff. This compromised the entire concept. An aircraft that required aerial refueling before beginning its mission had forfeited half its tactical value. 40 Mark Is were built between 1961 and 1963, and all were quietly withdrawn from frontline service by 1970. Salvation came from Derby. Rolls-Royce had been developing the IB 163 Spey, a twin-spool turbofan originally intended for the de Havilland Trident airliner. The Spey produced 11,100 pounds of thrust, a 56% increase over the Gyron Junior, and its bypass ratio of 0.64 gave significantly better fuel consumption at low altitude. The Admiralty authorized the re-engined variant, designated Buccaneer Mark II, in January 1962. The first Mark II, XN 974, flew from home on Spalding Moor on the 17th of May 1963. The transformation was extraordinary. The Mark II could launch with full internal fuel, a full weapon load, and climb away from the deck with authority. Ferry range increased from 1,500 to 2,300 nautical miles. Combat radius with Redbeard grew to approximately 600 nautical miles, finally meeting the original NA 39 specification 7 years late. The aircraft could now fly a full low-level profile without tanker support, loft its weapon, and return to the carrier with fuel in hand. Number 8. 101st Squadron embarked on HMS Victorious in October 1965 with Mark IIs. For the first time, the Royal Navy possessed the aircraft it had asked for in 1952. Across the Channel and the North Sea, NATO's other air forces were answering the same tactical question with different aircraft and, quietly, inferior results. The Federal Republic of Germany had signed its contract for 916 Lockheed F-104 Starfighters on the 6th of November 1958, a decision driven by Franz Josef Strauss, the defense minister, over the objections of several senior Luftwaffe officers. The Starfighter had been designed as a high-altitude interceptor to catch Soviet bombers over the American interior. Converted to the strike role as the F-104G, it carried the American B-43 or B-57 tactical nuclear weapon on a centerline pylon and was expected to fly low-level penetration missions into Warsaw Pact territory. The arithmetic of its adaptation was unforgiving. Between 1961 and 1984, the Luftwaffe lost 292 Starfighters in accidents, killing 116 pilots. The aircraft's small, highly loaded wing, designed for the thin air of the stratosphere, produced murderous gust response at sea level and gave the pilot almost no margin for error during weather penetration or systems failure. France took a different path. The Dassault Mirage IV-A, which first flew from Melun-Villaroche on the 17th of June 1959, was a supersonic delta-wing bomber carrying the AN-22 freefall weapon with a yield of 60 kilotons. It was a fine aeroplane in its own right, but it was designed around high-altitude penetration at Mach 2.2, with a low-level dash only as a terminal run-in. Its operational radius at low level was less than 700 nautical miles, and it required dedicated Boeing C-135 tanker support on every mission. The Armée de l'Air possessed only 62 Mirage IVs at peak strength, and they were committed entirely to the force-to-frap strategic deterrent under direct Élysée control. The Royal Netherlands Navy studied the Buccaneer carefully, sending a delegation under Rear Admiral Leendert Brough to Brough in November 1959. The Dutch operated the carrier Karel Doorman, formerly HMS Venerable, and they understood the sea-skimming concept better than most. Budget limitations ultimately drove them to the Hawker Seahawk, and later to land-based aircraft. But the technical reports filed with the Ministerie van Defensie explicitly acknowledged that the Buccaneer represented the correct solution to the maritime nuclear strike problem. The Royal Australian Navy conducted similar evaluations for HMAS Melbourne, reaching similar conclusions and similar budgetary dead ends. The shadow over all of this was the British Aircraft Corporation TSR-two, the Royal Air Force's own attempt at a low-level strike platform. First flown from Boscombe Down on the 27th of September 1964, the TSR-2 was technically ambitious, expensive, and politically vulnerable. The Royal Air Force regarded the Buccaneer with open contempt during this period, viewing it as a naval aircraft unsuited to the demanding penetration missions planned for the Central European theatre. Air Marshal Sir Ronald Lees told the Chief of the Defence Staff in February 1964 that the Buccaneer was a stopgap at best and wholly inadequate for the strategic role. The comparison tests told a different story. In September 1964, a Mark II Buccaneer flown by Lieutenant Commander Ted Anson from 801st Squadron flew a simulated strike profile against an exercise target in the Moray Firth. The aircraft maintained 100 feet above the waves at Mach 0.87 for the entire run. Weapon release was accurate to within 90 yards, and fuel remaining at recovery exceeded specification. No other NATO aircraft could have flown that profile. The document was Command Paper 2901, laid before Parliament on the 22nd of February 1966 and titled Statement on the Defence Estimates. Denis Healey, Secretary of State for Defence in Harold Wilson's Labour government, had spent 18 months conducting the most comprehensive strategic review since the Sandys White Paper of 1957. His conclusions were ruthless. The United Kingdom could no longer afford both an independent strategic nuclear deterrent and a blue water carrier force capable of operating east of Suez. Something had to give. Healey gave the carriers. Paragraph 22 of the paper stated that no new carrier would be built to replace HMS Ark Royal and HMS Eagle when they reached the end of their planned service lives in the late 1970s. The proposed CVA-01, which was to have been the largest warship built in Britain since the Second World War, displacing 54,500 tons and carrying a projected air group of 36 Buccaneers and Phantoms, was cancelled outright. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir David Luce, resigned on the 19th of February in protest, along with the Minister of Defence for the Royal Navy, Christopher Mayhew. The Admiralty had lost its strategic argument, and with the carriers went the purpose of the Buccaneer force. Or so it appeared. The Royal Air Force was simultaneously absorbing the consequences of the TSR-two cancellation, announced by Healey on the 6th of April 1965. The programme had exceeded its budget by several 100%. Political support had evaporated, and the two prototypes were ordered to be scrapped, their jigs destroyed at Weybridge and Samlesbury to prevent any future revival. The Americans offered the General Dynamics F-111K as a replacement, and initial orders were placed for 50 aircraft. The F-111K proved to be as troubled as its American sibling. Costs escalated, the swing-wing mechanism suffered repeated failures, and on the 16th of January 1968, Healey cancelled the F-111K contract as part of the accelerated withdrawal from east of Suez. The Royal Air Force now had no low-level strike aircraft and no prospect of obtaining one. The answer, pressed on a reluctant air staff by the Treasury and by the Chiefs of Staff Committee, was obvious: buy the Buccaneer. Air Chief Marshal Sir John Grandy, Chief of the Air Staff, formally requested the transfer of the existing Fleet Air Arm aircraft and the production of new build examples at a meeting in Whitehall on the 3rd of July 1968. The order went to Hawker Siddeley, which had absorbed Blackburn in 1963. 43 new Buccaneer Mark II-B aircraft were built at Brough and at home on Spalding Moor between 1968 and 1977. Number 12. Squadron Royal Air Force reformed at RAF Honington in Suffolk on the 1st of October 1969 as the first land-based Buccaneer unit. Number 237 Operational Conversion Unit followed at Honington in 1971. The aircraft's role now shifted from maritime nuclear strike to conventional and nuclear attack against Warsaw Pact forces, operating from airfields at Honington, Larbruch in West Germany, and later Lossiemouth. The WE-177 free-fall nuclear weapon replaced Redbeard in the primary nuclear role. The Buccaneer's terrain-hugging capability, derided by Air Marshal Lees only 4 years earlier, became the foundation of Royal Air Force low-level doctrine for the remainder of the Cold War. The naval aeroplane had inherited the Air Force it once scorned. The signal from Permanent Joint Headquarters at Northwood arrived at RAF Lossiemouth on the 26th of January 1991. 12 Buccaneer Mark II-B aircraft were to deploy to Muharraq in Bahrain within 72 hours, tasked with laser target designation for Tornado GR Mark I strike aircraft operating over western Iraq. Operation Granby, the British contribution to the coalition campaign to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait, had exposed a gap in Royal Air Force capability. The Tornado Force, trained for low-level penetration missions against Warsaw Pact airfields, had been pushed to medium altitude by Iraqi anti-aircraft artillery, and its Parvway 2 laser-guided bombs required a designator aircraft to illuminate the targets. The Buccaneer, fitted with the Parvway spike pod mounted on the port inner pylon, was the only aircraft in the inventory capable of the job. The deployed aircraft were drawn from 12 Squadron and 208 Squadron, most of them aeroplanes that had been in service since 1970 or earlier. The average airframe age exceeded 20 years. Crews at Lossiemouth repainted the aircraft in desert pink overnight, stenciled the names of whiskey distilleries on the noses, and flew the first operational sorties on the 2nd of February 1991. Flight Lieutenant Glenn Mason and his navigator, Flight Lieutenant Norman Brown, flying XV 863 named Sea Witch, designated targets for tornado strikes against the bridges over the Euphrates at Az, Samawa, and An Nasiriyah. Over the course of the campaign, Buccaneers flew 218 combat sorties, designated for 247 bombs, and lost no aircraft. The irony was considerable. An aeroplane designed in 1954 to sink Soviet cruisers with atomic weapons was, 37 years later, directing conventional precision munitions onto Iraqi infrastructure in daylight from medium altitude. The Buccaneer had outlived the Admiralty's fleet carriers, the Soviet Sverdlov cruisers it was built to kill, Redbeard, WE 177, the TSR-2, the F-111K, and indeed the Warsaw Pact itself. The Berlin Wall had fallen in November 1989. The Treaty of Final Settlement had been signed in September 1990, and the Soviet Union would formally dissolve on the 26th of December 1991. The war the Buccaneer had been built for would not now be fought. Withdrawal came in stages. The maritime attack role passed to the Tornado Gyron MarkIb in 1994, equipped with the Sea Eagle anti-ship missile that the Buccaneer had also carried in its final years. No. 2, 108th Squadron disbanded at Lossiemouth on the 31st of March 1994. A small number of aircraft continued in electronic warfare and trials roles at the Defence Research Agency at Farnborough and West Froy until the late 1990s, but the operational story ended in the Moray Spring of 1994. 209 production aircraft had been built. Approximately 60 survive today in museums and private collections, including XV 863 at the Royal Air Force Museum, Cosford, and XK 526 at Yorkshire Air Museum, Elvington. Barry Laight died in 2017 at the age of 97. In an interview filmed at Brough in 2008, he was asked what had made the Buccaneer work when so many contemporary programs had failed. He answered without hesitation. The team had been small, the specification had been honest, and the Royal Navy had known exactly what it wanted. The aircraft that resulted flew lower and hit harder than anything else NATO possessed. No other country had managed to build one.